me today, Stephen. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
I'm super excited about this interview because I have so many questions for you. You're the first that I'm able to ask a lot of these questions to. So please, I apologize if some of them sound a little bit simple-minded, but I want to cover it all. So let's get into it.
There are no dumb questions, right?
That's the right answer. What's it like living in Los Angeles, California?
Well, it's fine if you like it, which I happen to. It's of course it's a huge city, about 12.5 million people, but it's different than other large cities like Manhattan or New York or London, as it's spread out so much. Miles and miles, and it has different areas. I mean, in LA, like downtown LA, Beverly Hills, Hollywood, West Hollywood, that's all in what we call the basin, which heads down towards the ocean, where you have Santa Monica and Venice Beach. Now, they're incorporated cities, but they're part of what we call Greater Los Angeles. Then you go over the Hollywood Hills to the area that we call the Valley, and that's where I live, or the San Fernando Valley. And then there's a second valley where I grew up, actually, called San Gabriel Valley. And most of the cities there are incorporated somewhere in the county. LA County is even larger than the city. So it's a large city, but it doesn't quite have that same vibe as London or New York or even Edinburgh. But if you get to know the city and you love it, and I've lived here now since 1978, and you know the pockets of where there's interesting things to do, whether it be museums or theater, art, what have you, then it's a fine place. But also right now, our public transportation has really improved in the last 20 years. We actually have a subway, if you can imagine that, and they're building more and more. But for the last 10 years or so, my family and I have used the subway a lot, and we have some light rail trains. So, for example, I'm in the Valley, and we have one subway line that ends in North Hollywood, which is just east of me, and it takes 8 minutes for me to drive there. And I can get on the subway, and I can take it to downtown LA, to what we call our Grand Central, or not Grand Central, but the Union Station. And then you get on a light rail, and I can take it out in the San Gabriel Valley, and especially the Pasadena, where I was born. And next to Pasadena, there's this lovely little city called South Pasadena. And that's where I go to really cool down, because it's so quiet, and it's like a small town. And it was adored by Ray Bradbury. I'm sure you know who Ray Bradbury is, or was, I hope.
Sure.
Oh, Fahrenheit 451, Something Wicked This Way Comes, Dandelion Wine. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Must give you an education on Ray. This my book on Ray Bradbury. Ray is one of the greatest American authors. He died in 2012, and this year is his 100th anniversary of his birth. So there's been a lot of celebrations here. But yeah, his books, Martian Chronicles, Something Wicked This Way Comes, Dandelion Wine, and especially Fahrenheit 451, which is one of the great dystopian novels about in a future where firemen aren't there to save you if your house goes on fire. They're there to burn your books, to burn your libraries, because it's illegal to read. So he is considered one of the great American authors of the 20th century, and one of the most beloved. His fans are passionate about him. He was a very poetic writer, and one of the major influences on me as a writer.
So with that book that you have there, and I did see that you had written that book. What is the book based on? Do you just basically go through his publications and his life, or?
What this is, I call it Writings About the Writer and the Man, is different essays and articles I wrote about Ray, because in 2010, which was his 90th birthday, I decided that Los Angeles, and he's lived here since he was about 14, and Los Angeles was very, very important to Ray. He lived first in Venice, and then later in a area called Cheviot Hills which is just a little south of the 20th Century Fox film studio. He loved LA, and I said, Los Angeles can't let him turn 90 without doing something big. And I didn't know what that was going to be, but I contacted a man named Eric Garcetti, who's currently the mayor of Los Angeles. And at that time, he was the president of the city council here. And Eric I had met we had a Writers Guild strike in 2007, I guess. Yeah, 2007. And I met him because I spoke on behalf of the guild to the council and all that. So I contacted his people and I said, I'd like to talk about next year's being Ray's 90th birthday, and we really need to do something. And they said, yeah, contact us right after the first of the year. Let's get together and figure out what it can be. And so I said, fine, that's great. Unfortunately, this was part of the recession that happened, the big recession in 2006, 07. And by the time I had the meeting, I met with him and I said, look, I know the city's really hurting for cash, but there's one thing you can do, which all cities do, which is the name, they give an honor to someone by naming it so-and-so day, right? I'm sure they do that in Australia, correct? I hope. In any case, he said, well, Ray Bradbury is too big for a day. I'd like a month, but I'll take a week. And they said, well, let's talk to Eric. And they got back in a couple of days and said, okay, you've got a week. And then I said, oh shit, I've got a week. So I organized a bunch of different tributes to Ray throughout that week. Organized it all completely myself because I absolutely detest the idea of committees. So I did it all myself with certain organizations. So, for example, the day we had the city council named it Ray Bradbury Week, there was a big celebration at the city council and a reception afterwards. It was very moving. And then we did, I directed a one-act play of his called The Better Part of Wisdom at the Writers Guild. We had a program at the Writers Guild where we would do stage readings of plays or screenplays written by screenwriters over the age of 50. So we incorporated that and The Better Part of Wisdom, and I had James Cromwell in the lead. Now, you may know James Cromwell from Babe.
Wow.
Or Doggett or whatever his name was. And he was wonderful, and I had Seamus Dever, an actor from the TV series Castle. I don't know if that made it down to Australia. And
I haven't seen it though.
It's wonderful, wonderful show. He played the Irish cop that was on the team that it centered around. And so that was great. And then we had a screening of Fahrenheit 451, which was the film that Francois Truffaut made based on it in the 60s. And that was sponsored by Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Foundation. I got them to sponsor it. Now, the reason for that is Hugh Hefner, Fahrenheit 451, the novel, was serialized in issues 2, 3, and 4 of Playboy in the early 50s. And so Hugh Hefner and Ray contributed a lot of short stories to Playboy over the years, and they were close friends. And then there's another film based on his a short story and a play of his called The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit. That starred Joe Mantegna. That's an American actor. I don't know if you know him. The series he's been doing here in America for the last couple of years just ended. It's called Criminal Minds. And it's a wonderful film, and we screened that, and I had Joe and Ray there and the director to give a panel before the screening. And Ray was great, and his family, who was wonderful. He had 4 daughters, and I dealt almost exclusively with one daughter. She said, Ray loves all this, but the family has to tell you, you can't tell anybody that Ray will definitely make any of these events because he's 90, and and he had 2 strokes, by the way, and if he gets tired, he just won't go somewhere. So in all my publicity, I said, Mr. Bradbury hopes to attend most of the events, but we can't promise it, blah, blah. He showed up to almost every one of them. In fact, I probably diminished his life by 6 months. But he was in 7th heaven because it was his city, honoring him. The fans came out. And what Ray is known for is the love he puts into his work and the love he sends out into the world. So he was getting a lot of love back. And I felt very, very good about that. And we had a great time. So there's a Facebook page called Ray Bradbury Week in Los Angeles. And on there are videos and pictures and I had an online art gallery show of works inspired by Ray or his work that I had people in the animation industry do. You can get on there and see those sort of things. So it's up and live and fun. But yeah, Ray, you need to check out Ray Bradbury.
I will. I want to come back to the start for you when, as you're just talking about Ray being an inspiration for you, I want to talk about what got you into writing, how you knew that this was the career that you wanted to pursue, or was it just an opportunity one day that you stumbled into and it just went off from there?
No, it was, I was a big reader as a kid, originally mainly DC comic books, but also, kids science fiction books and different books and books about people like our American heroes of Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett and stuff like that. And I got a little more sophisticated in my reading, and my three main inspirations in my teen years, and maybe a little beyond, were Ray Bradbury, specifically in Martian Chronicles, the opening section called Rocket Summer. It showed me how poetic you can be in prose and how you could use words. And then a big influence was Ian Fleming, author of the James Bond novels. Now, I grew up when James Bond was a huge thing in the 60s when it first became Bond mania. But I turned to the books. And Ian Fleming was actually quite a damn fine writer and stylist. He had been a journalist. And there was a lot there that inspired me. And then W. Somerset Maugham, the English author of short stories and novels and plays, especially his Of Human Bondage, because that's the first book I ever read where I was totally immersed in the characters, invested in the characters and in the scene and in the landscape. And he's in Paris in part of the book, he's in London. And I said, man, this is incredible. But what really turned me was as a sophomore in high school, because at first I wanted to be a lawyer, until I realized I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I just wanted to give summations in front of juries because it was dramatic, you see, do the other work. So I discovered that. I joined the drama department, and that saved my life. And I took high school drama. And then I was introduced to Arthur Miller, the playwright, and Tennessee Williams and other playwrights, and learning about that. But oddly enough, by the time I graduated, I decided I didn't want to be an actor. I wanted to be a writer. Now, partly I didn't want to be an actor, and I loved acting, but because I had this crazy thought that actors had to be 6 feet. And I was 5'1". So I figured, okay, I can't be an actor because I was just stupid, But the real thing is, the serious thing is, I became more enamored with the words and the idea of authorship than being the interpreter of the words, being the actor. And I'm a ham, I'll perform in front of anybody. But it was the word. Someone created these characters. Someone created this world. And I was writing poetry at the time and short stories, few of which was any good at all. But that's what really, really got to me. So that was my first thing. I wanted to be a writer. And then later on, my first real writing, in a sense, was in college. I wrote a column for my college newspaper, which was satiric, because basically that's what I am, a satirist. And they were about things, and they were about politics, and they were about this and that. And it was even about smoking. I think I had one, which I was against. And then later, after a young marriage and an early fatherhood, and then the end of that marriage, and all during that time, I worked in retail. I wound up working at a magazine, an arts magazine in Los Angeles called New World. I was writing reviews, and I was doing articles about art and what have you. And eventually that led to joining a friend of mine in a film tabloid about film. And he was a film collector. At that time, he collected 8mm or 16mm. This was even before videotape. And he wanted to do this tabloid newspaper for film collectors. And I said, well, I'll join you for that, but it's got to be about all of film, the history of film, today's film. Let's review today's movies. Let's interview. And so I broadened it out as the managing editor, and we did that for 10 issues. And it failed, unfortunately, but got me a job with an animators society called a CIFA as the executive director. And that eventually led to working at a film festival, which eventually led to me, and I fell in love with animation. I just fell in love with character animation, especially hand-drawn character animation. And that led me into deciding to be a publicist for animation studios, which led me into deciding I have to produce because that's the only way I'm going to see animation that I really want to see. So that took me away from my writing, except at night I was writing my first novel all this time. I never really gave it up. It's just that allure of Hollywood, and especially this love I had of animation, just really drew me in. And that was, there were good times at those times.
I'm very curious because I love anime, so more so the Japanese style anime and manga, but I can really appreciate it. And it was a massive influence for me when I was a teenager in started shaping my writing as well, just the way that it was expressed and even the art. And so I'm curious, are you an artist yourself? And if not, how is the process of being able to lead a team? I'm assuming that's what you do, lead a team of artists to create these animations. What is that process like?
Well, no, I can't draw. I always said the only thing I can draw is blood on occasion. This was my problem. I was in love with an art form that wasn't my art form because I was still always writing, and few people even knew I was writing. But I fell so in love with the power of character animation, and at that time, and we're talking the late 70s, animation in America, worldwide, was completely in the doldrums. Disney was everybody said was on the last legs. The only thing being produced, like up in Canada, they were doing Care Bear movies. I don't know if you know the Care Bears, and none of which I liked. And I had gotten to know and did publicity for Chuck Jones. Now, I never know if you ever heard of Chuck Jones. He's one of the great Looney Tune directors of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, all those great cartoons of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he was still very active, and I did his publicity. Later on in 1990, he and I formed a company, Chuck Jones Productions. I was president of that for a couple of years. But what you do, I was the kind of producer that tried to develop projects. And I wanted animation to become more sophisticated and not just do kiddie movies. And indeed, part of the inspiration of that was Japanese animation, because much more sophisticated in the type of stories they were telling. I was a big fan of Miyazaki's Lupin III, Castle of Cagliostro. Okay. In fact, I would even screen it at different events and talk about where animation could go. And what happened is one day, I was doing basically publicity for studios. It was Chuck Jones, Bill Melendez, who did all the Charlie Brown specials, which I'm sure must have run in Australia, right?
Yeah,
Peanuts,
yeah.
Brown, right? And Richard Williams, who later directed the animation for Roger Rabbit, and all these people. They were small studios, so I could do them. And I didn't charge them anything, so they couldn't tell me what to do. I was there to learn. That's how, I was like a little barnacle in their butts learning what was going on. So I learned the process. But then in 70 or 80, early 80, I was talking to a friend about what I wanted to see in animation. He had an animation camera service. This is where you took the picture of the one shot after another. And he did that for studios around town. He said, well, I shot a picture for a young guy who studied at Cal Arts, which was a big art college funded originally by Disney. And he worked at Disney for a while. I think he's independent now, but he and some friends put together this film, which is all pencil test, but it looks like a trailer for a film they want to do based on this comic book called The Spirit. And I knew this. This was a comic book by a brilliant artist named Will Eisner that came out in the 40s in America. And so I go to his animation studio and I look at this test, which several years ago I found an old copy of it, and I put it up on YouTube. You can see it. And I said, this is great. Who did it? And he said, it's a young guy named Brad Bird. Now, I don't know if you know who Brad Bird is now, right? Okay, director of The Incredibles, Ratatouille. Okay.
Really?
Yeah. So that was Brad. And I said, I got to meet this guy. And so they set it up for the next day. And I said to him, I want to help you get this off the ground. Let's try to sell this somewhere. And he said, well, what's so bright. I'll only work with Steven Spielberg, Francis Coppola, George Lucas, or Gary Kurtz. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Spielberg, Coppola, and Lucas. Gary Kurtz you may not have heard of, but he actually was Lucas's producer. He produced American Graffiti, and he produced the very first Star Wars, and he produced the second one, Empire Strikes Back. Well, I had gotten to meet Gary Kurtz because of my work at this film festival. So I knew how to get a hold of his assistant. He worked like Lucas outside of the San Francisco area. So I called them up and I pitched the idea. And I found out later that Bunny, his assistant, would have totally ignored me except for the fact that she liked me over the phone. And it was a pitch for The Spirit, which was one of Gary's favorite comic books, because he was a huge comic book collector. And in fact, in his new offices, because he had left Lucasfilm at this point, in his new offices, he had a fireproof vault for his comic collection.
Wow.
So he wound up, we had a meeting, we showed him this trailer, which was like a trailer for a movie, okay? And it done beautifully. And it was the best human character animation I had ever seen. And by the way, I really wanted to see more humans in animation and less cute talking animals. Not that I have anything against cute talking animals, but I really wanted more sophistication. So Gary said, let's do it. And he had me, I wasn't even working for him, he had me contact Will Eisner and start to negotiate the rights to this thing, which I did. And when Gary's lawyers found out that I actually wasn't working for Gary, they were freaking out. Eventually, I did work for Gary. 2 years into this process, I was going to be associate producer on this thing. So this was my entrance into producing. 2 years into it, I said to Gary, because I was supporting myself with these little publicity jobs, which are dropping by the wayside because I was so busy working on the Spirit project. I said, yeah, you got anything for me? Because he wound up hiring Brad, and he wound up hiring Brad's artistic partner, and they were making money, and I was sitting there like a schmuck, right? And he said, yeah, actually, I have a project, and I'd like you to come on board and be my director of animation development and be the associate producer on that film as well. I said, sure. Well, it turned out to be a co-production with the Japanese. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, they're very interested in adapting American animation techniques to what they're doing. I said, well, I would be very interested in them because they do more. So we start to put that together. It was based on an old American comic strip called Little Nemo and Slumberland. And the first thing I said to Gary is, we got to name it just Nemo. Just get the Little Nemo. Slumberland, but it's a brilliant early 20th century comic strip by Winsor McKay. And we met with him, and I actually knew about this project because the Japanese had come to Chuck Jones when I was doing his publicity and to see if he'd be interested. They wanted an American partner. That was the big deal. And Chuck recommended as a screenwriter, another great lover of comic books, Ray Bradbury. So he had me take the Japanese, the head of the studio, TMS, Tokyo Movie Shinsha, to meet Ray in his office at that time in Beverly Hills. And I had already met Ray because of our mutual love of animation. And he was got involved, and he came to our parties and things like that. But then I started working for Gary for 2 years, and I had no idea what happened. It was the same project. Chuck turned it down. They went to Lucas, George Lucas. Lucas turned it down and said, but you should talk to Gary Kurtz. And Gary Kurtz was taking it on. So my task was to put together the American animation team. The Japanese animation team was being headed up by, guess who? Miyazaki. You know Miyazaki.
Yeah.
You got to know Miyazaki.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, what?
Yeah, Miyazaki. He was the head of the Japanese artistic team.
You got to meet him.
Miyazaki. Hayao Miyazaki.
You got to meet him.
Oh, yeah, I worked with him.
I'm leaving. I'm kidding. I'm so jealous right now. Wow.
I have somewhere, it's in a drawer, I have a little caricature he did of me sweating over a piece of fish. And he drew this one night when we were out to dinner, and I told him my philosophy is sushi. which is the only thing that should eat a raw fish is another raw fish. And because the Japanese go, oh, oh, they couldn't understand that. The problem is Miyazaki didn't want to make the movie we wanted to make, and after a year, he vacated and formed Ghibli, and the rest is history on his end. But we went on, and I spent a year in Tokyo, married my assistant. She wasn't Japanese; she'd been my assistant here, and we actually met at the film festival here called Filmex. The twain wasn't going to meet on this, because the Japanese were very reluctant to listen to the gaijin, which are foreigners, especially Miyazaki. He didn't like us much, to be honest with you. But they had other ones, especially Otsuka-san, who was a great grandfather of Japanese animation. He loved what we were trying to do, and he became a dear friend. And he gave me like a sketchbook he did when he was a young man, when the American occupational forces were there. And he first saw like the Spirit comic and things like that the GIs brought. Anyway, it was an interesting 2 years, but after 2 years, I told Gary, I got to get back to Hollywood or I'm not going to have a career here. So I returned to America. He left, I think, several months later, and some of the team I put together, which included, by the way, Roger Allers, who later went on to co-write and co-direct The Lion King, wow, and co-write the Broadway version of The Lion King. He was one of the animators that I picked. I found him up in Canada, working for a Canadian. He's an American, but he was working for a Canadian outfit called Nelvana. So my job was to organize them, get them, and my emphasis was always on the people who could deliver the best character animation. That's the actual performances of the characters, which is, as I try to explain to people all the time, animation is not a graphic art. It's a performance art. Yeah. So you have to think of it like acting, like ballet, like performance. The drawings and the backgrounds are like production design. That's all it is. And I would be infuriated by how many reviews of an animated feature I would read that would say, the animation was great, the backgrounds were beautiful. And there was hardly a comma between that in that sentence, you see. People just thought animation was drawing. Yeah. They didn't understand the art of creating these characters, making them come alive and making them there. Now, it's something the Japanese are not as good at, in my estimation, as the American animators were. But they were the best at it for what they did. Yeah. It wasn't important to them, because there's a difference between American and Japanese art, or Western art, let's call it. In Western art, it's all about the form. Yeah. It's all about the bulk and the form. In Japanese art, it's all about the line. So there's a difference. But the Japanese never, although they make a lot of animation for kiddies, they don't consider it an exclusively a children's form, or manga for that matter. If you ever live in Japan or go to Japan and go on the subway, you'll see most of the salarymen there going to work reading a manga. You know, they're not reading Saul Bellow or Philip Roth. Some are, I suppose, but they're reading mangas. So, but that's what got me into it. And I came home and was trying to be a producer by finding projects. I wrote some myself. I got some others going, and we had, Hollywood is a difficult place. We got, I started Chuck Jones Productions with Chuck Jones. When I left there, a partner of mine who had been involved early days of the Spirit, we formed a company. We immediately made a 2-picture deal at Columbia, had a deal at MGM, I believe as well, which we started finally, which was going to be a big feature version of the cartoon character from the 30s, Betty Boop. Now, do you know Betty Boop?
Yeah, I know Betty Boop.
Boop. Okay, but 3 months into that, after spending $1 million, and I opened a studio, I hired all the people. We had, I don't know if you know these actors, but Bernadette Peters was going to be Betty. She's a great American singer, actress, Broadway musical actress here, Bernadette Peters. Scott Bakalo was the romantic interest. Scott, you may know from Star Trek Enterprise, was the Star Trek thing that he was the captain of. So he's one of the Star Trek captains. But 3 months into it, the man who was the head of MGM who bought it, who was Alan Ladd Jr., or known as Laddie, he was a famous guy in Hollywood, and his father had been Alan Ladd, the great American star, film star. He got fired, and the new guy just couldn't see it, and he pulled the plug. And it just broke my heart. The script was by my partner. It was going to be a sophisticated, jazz-infused story about Betty. We had a jazz musician named Benny Wallace doing the score. So that broke my heart. And I went home and I wrote a novel.
What novel was that?
Blood is Pretty. Let's see, I grabbed that one. That was the first one that I actually had published. I had written a long novel before that, which is still yet to be published. I'm not sure I ever will. It's like, the first novel. I got to take a look at it. The first Fixer adventure. There's a second one called Hollywood is an All-Volunteer Army, which is only an ebook right now. And that title comes from, I would sit around with other people in Hollywood and they would bitch and moan about how awful Hollywood is. And I'd just look, which it was absolutely correct. And then I would say, hey, Hollywood is an all-volunteer army. You know how many recruits you have that want your space?
Yeah.
But I was not, I used to tell people, you've heard the term, what a day job is?
Yeah.
Okay. And people in Hollywood, but the real day jobs is they're a waiter or a waitress or something like that if they're going to be an actor. And I used to tell people, actually, my day job is Hollywood. What I really want to do is write novels.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wrote that, and the day after I finished the first draft, my partner and I got a call from Ivan Reitman. Now, Ivan Reitman was a director, did Ghostbusters, and oh my God, some of the great Meatballs, I think he did with Bill Murray, and he was a great comedy director. And he was going to do a film called Space Jam, which was going to be Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes guys with the great basketball player, Michael Jordan, live action animation combination. And I love the Looney Tunes, obviously, but I'm not a sports guy, okay? So I didn't care about the basketball aspect of it. But I said, okay, what's the problem? And he said, well, he can't find any animators. I said, okay, well, we'll take a meeting. And he said, because right then, this was when animation wasn't in the doldrums, right? This is after Little Mermaid came out. And Disney was suddenly exploding. And every major studio, Warner's and MGM and Sony, I think they all opened their animation divisions. Most of them didn't know what the hell they were doing. Disney had like 50 years on them, right? So you couldn't find animators. And Ivan said, none of the big studios, there was a Warner Brothers film, so you couldn't go to any other studios. And the Warner Brothers animation, they had actually started a unit, but they were doing their own feature, something about Camelot. So the only animators he's been able to even start some development were from the TV unit, which is a different kettle of fish. And he said, and we've gone to some small independent animators and nobody wants to touch us. And we don't know how to get this made. And we've got to start principal photography in, I don't know, it was like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And where they would film all the Michael Jordan stuff. And the reason they were stuck with that is because eventually he had to go back and play basketball, right? Because he was being paid millions and millions of dollars to do that. So I said, yeah, we know how to do it. We can do that for you. And he said, you can? He said, how? Well, we had come off Betty Boop. And we were in the same thing with Betty Boop. And that was a full animation features. And the way I put that together, quite frankly, taking an idea from the man who was going to direct for us, because he came up with the idea, and I'll give him full credit. His name was Steve Moore. Is he said, there's these great animation studios worldwide. And they're almost always started by a master animator, a really good talent. And a lot of animation studios here in America will go to these studios to pick up work, to do things that they don't have the time to do. He said, my idea is get them involved from day one. Make each of these small animation studios what is called an animation unit. This is how Disney did it, through different units. Make the head guy the directing animator for that unit and get him involved from day one in development and character design and everything. And that's exactly what we were doing on Betty Boop. I had a studio in Ohio. We had a studio in Copenhagen. We had a studio, at least one studio in London. And then the rug got pulled out from us. So Ivan said, you can. I explained all this. So in 3 days, no hyperbole, in 3 days, over the phone, I had put together an ad hoc animation studio. And we flew in. I had 2 studios in London. The studio in Ohio we were using before. Flew in the head guys. They all came to Hollywood. Ivan's, despite he's doing this for Warner Brothers, his office was at Universal Studios. We all got into a bunch of trailers at Universal Studios and started developing the animation portion of it. And then it kind of snowballed from there, and we wound up getting the film made with decent character animation, I'm happy to say. I didn't like the rest of the film. It was a horrible script.
I remember very vaguely watching it as a child too, and it's so fascinating to hear this side. Like, I'm absolutely enthralled at the moment by this, because I've always been curious as to what happens, because obviously it's a lot that happens in the background, but people only really focus on the actors or the forefront of what actually goes into a film, and not of what goes back. And especially like animation, because that's something that I love. It's so fascinating to hear this side of it. Like, it's really intrigued me. What advice would you give to somebody now if this was something, a career path that they wanted to, what would be the small steps that they would have to get into that? Because by the sounds of your story, it sounds like a lot of it was networking. You got in, you went in, you weren't getting paid for things. You were learning from them. You were being there for it. And I wonder if people, say, in my generation would have the same gusto as that. Maybe not. But what would you suggest for them to do to even step into that world?
It depends specifically on what they want to do. If they want to act, if they want to write, if they want to produce, or if they want to work behind the scenes in cinematography or even as an electrician. But obviously it's good to be in a city that produces a lot of film. So a major media center, either New York or Hollywood or London, places like that. There's a lot of film schools now. So that's the route so many young people are taking. They go through film schools. And a lot of people who want to be directors write a screenplay to try to be able to direct it. They're not necessarily invested with being a writer, but they just want to get the director, because the director in film is the God Almighty, right? So it really just depends on that. But yeah, you got to start doing anything anybody will allow you to do. And it is, I don't like the word networking, and I've never been good at it. But I have a good friend, a man named Ken Cragen, who is a very famous producer and personal manager in Hollywood for many, many years. He may come up again as we talk, because he figures into my life. But he wrote a book called Life is a Contact Sport. And it was all about that, building contacts and using them. So I think that's the way it works in all life. I think if you're in the shoe business, if the better contacts you have, the more you're going to be able to go up in the shoe business. But in film, we want, I've been out of it for 20 years. They want people that are passionate, but it's a glamorous business. So a lot of people come there for the glamour, and they don't necessarily put in the hard work. So, people, the wannabes, drop like rotten fruit off trees. It takes perseverance. It takes persistence, more or less the same thing, and patience. Because you don't know when you're going to wake up the next morning and suddenly something's going to be offered to you. And it's luck. As anybody will tell you, it's luck. But as anybody who's been through it will tell you also, it's preparing yourself to recognize luck when it's thrown in your face and to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's study. Film is a very technical, mechanistic art form, especially with CGI and everything. So there's schools. It's probably you need to go to school to learn your craft, and then through the school, often, especially if you're going to school that has contacts with the industry, that's what gets you there. Make your short film, submit it to the film festivals, all that normal stuff.
I'd actually have to split this video into 2 parts, I'm realizing, because like this is amazing. Sorry?
I told you I'm a ham.
No, I love it. Like I knew it'd be like a fascinating interview, but I'm taking so much from this, and so I just want to ask more and more questions. Well, I am going to leave it at that. It went a lot longer than I thought. I'll split this into 2 videos. Thank you so much for helping on today, Stephen.
Very much. Thank you very much, and best of luck with all your work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I will talk to you soon.